The instrument had never lied to Registrar Aminet in 30 cycles of service. So when the density readout for cell 9 climbed past the top grid line and kept climbing, his first act was to strike the panel with the flat of his hand, the way a Selvig technician struck any machine that had begun to dream. The number did not fall. It rose. Tissue density in the subject on the marrowing bench had passed the Vantor ceiling. The ceiling, the line the iron caste's own physicians had drawn 1,000 cycles ago and declared the outer wall of living strength. And it was still rising, gridline by gridline, as calm and steady as a tide coming in over flat sand. Aminet did not panic. Selvig did not panic. That was Vantor work, and he was not Vantor. He recalibrated the instrument. He ran the diagnostic cascade twice. He replaced the density coupler with a fresh unit from the sealed drawer, its wax stamp cracking under his thumb. He fed the machine a control sample, a preserved wedge of iron cast muscle kept in the reference vault precisely so that a registrar could prove on any given shift that his instruments told the truth. The machine read the control at its known value exactly to the last decimal. Then it read cell 9 again, and cell 9 was still climbing. He looked up from the panel for the first time in an hour and put his 4 eyes to the observation glass. The subject on the bench was not a Vantor. The subject on the bench was small. That was the word that arrived first, before caste or species or protocol. Small, folded onto a bench built to cradle warriors twice its length, its limbs thin, its skin bare and pale and marked with the faint dark lines the marrowing left when it went deep. It slept the drugged sleep of the deep phase, chest rising and falling in a rhythm too quick for any Threnvi, and its face, turned toward the glass, was a human face. Aminet stood very still. Somewhere below the observation deck the hold went on with its afternoon, the daylight pouring down through the great dome and laying its clean bright bars across the conditioning floors, and none of it reached him. He had a human on a marrowing bench. He had a human 3 cycles into the attunement. The Rite the Concordat had reserved for the iron caste since before the Threnvi had left their birth mud. And the instrument that had never lied to him was telling him, in the flat, honest language of numbers, that the human was already stronger than any warrior the hold had ever made. He did what a Selvig did. He went to the record. The intake ledger for the current cohort lived in the registrar's vault, a column of sealed cylinders each holding one candidate's provenance, and Aminet pulled them one at a time and read them in the cold blue light until he found the fault. It was a small fault. That was the thing that would keep him awake through the long cycles after, how small it was. 2 cylinders had been logged on the same shift, 40 days back. A Vantor candidate named Oskarek, iron caste, 3rd generation, the son of a line master, cleared for the attunement by 3 examiners and a blood right. And a labor allotment, a shipment of threshold stock brought up from the surface pens to be assigned to the annexes as floor hands and waste haulers, and the 100 other tasks the caste system did not think worth a Threnvi's hands. The labor allotment had carried a manifest. One line of that manifest read, Unit, Human, Female, Provenance Threshold Grade 9, Designation Pending. And someone, a clerk, a tired Selvig underling working the night intake with a stylus that skipped, or a machine reading a smeared tag, had entered the human's provenance token into the field where Oskarek should have gone, and entered Oskarek into the labor pool, and the cohort roster had closed for the cycle, and the sealed order had gone out to the marrowing hall. Bench the candidate in cell 9, begin the attunement. Oskarek, iron caste, son of a line master, was somewhere in the surface pens hauling waste, and the human, designation pending, was on the bench. Aminet read the fault 4 times. Then he set the cylinder down, and for a moment the enormity of it sat on him like weather. A candidate wrongly benched could be unbenched in the first phase, the early conditioning flushed, the body returned to itself with nothing lost but time. But the marrowing was the deep phase. Once the marrowing set, the Rite could not be pulled back. It was not a coat you took off but a thing that had grown into the frame, thread by thread, down at the level where the body made itself. 3 cycles in, the human was past the point of any reversal the Selvig knew. And the human was climbing. He should have gone to the warden. Protocol was clear on faults of provenance. A registrar who found one carried it up the caste ladder with both hands and let the ladder decide. But Aminet stood at the glass a moment longer, watching the small chest rise and fall too fast, and he found that his hands were not moving toward the summons key. He was a physician before he was a registrar. Under the caste and the protocol and the 30 cycles of clean instruments, he was a physician, and a physician looked at a body and asked one question before all the others. He asked it now of the human on the bench. Not how did this happen, not whose fault, he asked, what is it doing to you? The attunement was not a gift. The Selvig did not use that word, though the Vantor did in their rites and their boasts, the gift of the marrowing, the strength conferred. The Selvig knew what it was. It was a controlled injury sustained across 40 days, a deliberate breaking down of the body's careful settlements so that it would rebuild them denser, faster, harder, wrong in every way that made a warrior and right in none that made a long life. Vantor who took the right gained the strength and lost the cycles. An iron caste warrior at the height of his conferred power was already dying of it, and knew, and called the dying honor. It broke them to make them. That was the price, and the price was the point, and the price was why the caste hoarded the right like a relic. Only the strongest frame could survive the breaking, and only a warrior was raised from the first breath to want to. The human had not been raised to want anything but survival, and the human's body was not breaking. Aminet pulled the marrowing telemetry, the deep record, the one the machine kept for the physicians and not the boast rites, and read it with the care he gave to a thing he did not understand. Every Vantor who came through the marrowing showed the same signature, the breaking down, sharp and early, a body torn open on purpose. Then the rebuild, slower, the new dense tissue laid down over the wound. Then the long, quiet failure underneath, the cost, the cycles bleeding out of the frame even as the strength came in. The signature was a wound that healed into a scar that killed you slowly. It was the shape of the Rite. The human's telemetry had the breaking down. It had the rebuild. But underneath, where the Vantor showed the long, quiet failure, the human showed nothing. No cost. The frame took the injury of the Rite and closed it and did not keep the wound. Where a warrior's body spent itself to become strong, the human's body simply became strong, and paid, as far as the deep record could see, nothing at all. That was not possible. Aminet had spent 30 cycles inside the possible. He pulled the physician's reference, the great settled body of Selvig knowledge, the accumulated truth of 10,000 marrowings, and it told him, in the calm voice of every physician who had ever come before him, that what the instrument was showing him could not occur. The Rite broke the frame. That was its nature. A frame that did not break was not a frame the Rite could work on, and the Rite would slide off it and do nothing. The Rite was not sliding off the human. The Rite was working, and the frame was not breaking. He sat with that for a long moment in the blue light of the vault, an old careful Selvig and a column of sealed cylinders and one human asleep behind glass. And he understood, not the biology would take him cycles, and he was not sure the cycles would give it up, but the shape of the thing. He understood that a mistake made on a night shift by a skipping stylus had fed the iron caste's most guarded right into a body the caste had classed as disposable labor, threshold stock, designation pending. And the body had taken the Rite the way dry ground takes rain, all of it, and asked for more, and paid nothing. He understood that if he took this up the ladder would not ask his question. The ladder would ask a Vantor question, and the Vantor question, put to a human wearing the iron caste's strength without the iron caste's leave, had only ever had one answer. Aminet resealed the cylinders. He logged the fault because a Selvig who did not log was no Selvig, but he logged it to his own registrar's ledger, the working record, and not yet to the summons chain. He told himself this was procedure. A registrar verified before he escalated. He would verify. He would go down to cell 9 when the deep phase lifted and the human woke, and he would run the full physician's assessment with his own hands. And only then, with a complete and honest record, would he carry it up the ladder as protocol required. He told himself that, and knew part of it for the lie it was. The other part, the part that was a physician before it was anything, simply wanted to see the human's eyes open, wanted to know what was inside the frame that had done the impossible thing and paid nothing. Wanted, before the latter took it out of his hands, to look at what they had made by accident and ask it the only question that had ever mattered to him. The daylight moved across the dome. The instrument in cell 9 went on climbing, slower now, approaching some ceiling of its own that the Selvig did not have a gridline for, and Aminet sat in the vault and waited for the deep phase to lift, and did not send the summons. The deep phase lifted on the 4th cycle, near the middle of the bright watch, and the human woke the way nothing the hold had ever benched woke, all at once and quiet. Aminet was at the glass. He had told the marrowing attendants he would conduct the wake assessment himself, a registrar's prerogative, unusual but not forbidden, and the attendants were glad enough to be spared a shift with a subject whose numbers had begun to frighten the junior staff. So he was alone on the observation deck when the human's eyes opened, and he saw the whole of it. No thrash, no cry, no slow swim up from the drug the way the Vantor came up, roaring, half in the rights of their fathers. The human simply opened its eyes and lay still, and looked at the ceiling of cell 9, and Aminet watched it understand where it was. He watched it not panic. He had expected panic. Threshold stock, taken from the surface pens, waking on a warrior's bench in the deep of an institution it could not have understood. Panic was the only reasonable response, and Aminet had braced for the noise of it, the way one braced for a patient coming up wrong. Instead, the human lay still and moved its eyes across the cell, corner to corner, the restraints, the glass, the instruments, and Aminet had the distinct and unwelcome sense of being counted, of being one item in an assessment that was running behind those quick dark eyes, as surely as his own ran behind the panel. Then the human spoke, and the cell's old translator matrix, installed for interrogations, never once used for a marrowing subject, caught it, and rendered it into flat Selvig trade cant in the cell's overhead voice. How long, the human said, not screamed, asked, as if it had a schedule. Aminet keyed the deck's channel before he had decided to. You have been on the bench 41 days, he said. You are in meridian hold. You are not in danger from me. The human turned its head toward the glass, toward him, though it could not see him through the one-way pane, only the dark rectangle where a watcher would stand, and was quiet for a moment, and then said, You're the first one who said that and meant part of it. Aminet had interviewed 900 subjects across 30 cycles. None of them had ever assessed his sincerity and graded it partial and been right. He found he had nothing ready to say. My name is Registrar Aminet, he said, because a name was a thing a physician gave. Of the Selvig caste, I keep the records of this cohort. There has been an error in those records. You were not meant to be on that bench. I know, the human said. You, Aminet stopped. You know. I've had 4 days of your machines telling me things through the walls, the human said, and about 6 years before that of being told what I'm not meant for. I know what a mistake looks like from the inside of one. It flexed one thin hand against the restraint, testing, not straining, a measurement, not an escape. You gave me something that was for somebody else. And now it's in me and you can't get it out. And you're up there behind the glass trying to decide whether that makes me a problem you fix or a problem you erase. Aminet was silent. My name is Ren, the human said, since you gave yours. It seemed fair. Down on the conditioning floors the daylight lay in its clean bright bars, and the hold went on with its bright watch, and Registrar Aminet of the Selvig caste stood behind the glass and understood, with the particular clarity of a careful man watching the ground open, that the error in his ledger was awake and calm, and already 3 moves ahead of the institution that had made it. He ran the assessment himself in the cell with the restraints off. That was a breach. A marrowing subject was assessed under restraint until the Vantor examiners cleared it, and the examiners cleared nothing they had not first seen strain against the straps and fail. But Aminet had watched Ren test the restraint and declined to fight it, and he had made a physician's judgment that a body which could measure a strap and choose not to break it was a body he could stand beside. He carried the judgment down to cell 9 himself and unlocked the straps with his own registrar's key, and the 2 junior attendants outside the door went very quiet and did not look at each other. And Aminet knew the breach was already climbing the informal ladder that ran under the formal one, the ladder of who saw what, faster than any summons he might have sent. Ren sat up on the bench. Slowly, not from weakness. Aminet's instruments told him there was no weakness anywhere in the frame, but with the deliberateness of someone who had decided that slow was the correct speed for the room. She was a head and a half shorter than Aminet, thin the way the surface pens made their stock thin, her pale skin marked all over with the fine dark tracery of the marrowing, and she looked up at him with those quick counting eyes and waited to be examined, as if she had done this before, as if the bright, terrible institution around her were merely one more place that intended to measure her and find her wanting. He measured her. He found at every station of the assessment that the instruments had not lied. Grip passed the Vantor ceiling, and she was not trying. He gave her the dynamometer, the calibrated iron core the iron caste crushed as a rite of passage in their 3rd conferral, and asked her to close her hand until he said stop, and she watched his face and closed her hand slowly, and he said stop well before the core deformed, because he had seen the load reading, and it was already past the number that any Threnvi hand had ever reached, and she was closing it as gently as one closed a hand on a smaller creature one did not intend to harm. Recovery. He took a tissue sample, the small deliberate injury the assessment required, and watched the wound on her forearm. On a Vantor, the sample wound closed in a day and left the long, slow caste underneath. On Ren it closed while he watched, not fast enough to be a trick of the eye, but fast enough that by the end of the assessment the mark was a pale line, and by the next bright watch it would be nothing, and the deep telemetry showed no cost, no cycles spent, the frame paying for the healing out of some account the Selvik could not find the bottom of. Nerve conduction past the ceiling. Endurance under load, the machine gave up before she did, every station the same. And at every station, Ren did exactly as much as he asked, and not one increment more, watched his face for the word to stop and stopped on it, held the enormous new strength of her frame on a leash so short and so steady that Aminet, who had spent 30 cycles among the iron caste, among warriors who wore their conferred power like a drawn blade, and could not pass a doorway without measuring it against their shoulders, found the restraint more frightening than the numbers. "You are not straining," he said at the last station. "At any of these, you could give the machines more." "You could stop asking me to," Ren said, "any time you wanted, but you keep asking because you need to know how bad it is." She lowered the load bar to the bench without a sound, "So I keep answering. But I'm not going to hand you the top of it, Registrar. Nobody who's ever measured me has done anything good with the top of it. You'll get what you need to write your record. You won't get the ceiling." Aminet looked at her for a long moment. "There may not be a ceiling," he said. It was the first true thing he had said aloud since the number climbed past his grid line, and saying it in the cell to the human felt like setting down a weight he had been carrying alone. "Your frame took the Rite and paid nothing. We have never seen that. The Rite is a wound that heals into a slow death. In you it healed into more of you. I do not have a category for what you are. I do not think my caste has one." Ren was quiet, then she said, "You keep calling it a Rite. Back home we'd call it a mistake and a poison and a thing somebody did to me without asking." She flexed the hand that had crushed nothing. "But your face when you say it, you're not proud of it. You're scared of it. That's new. Everybody else who's had a hand in me was proud. I am Selvig, Aminet said. We are not raised to pride. We are raised to the record. He gathered the instruments. And the record I am now required to carry up the ladder says that a mistake in my ledger has made a human stronger than any warrior in the Concordat, at no cost to the human, and that the process cannot be reversed. I do not know what the ladder will do with that record. I know what the ladder is. Tell me, Ren said. So he told her. Standing in the daylight that fell through the high slot windows of Cell 9, an old Selvig registrar told a young human exactly what she had woken into. The caste order of the Threnvi, iron at the crown of it, the rite that made the iron cast iron, the thing the caste would understand her to be, not a person the rite had blessed but a theft, a laborer wearing the warrior's strength without the warrior's leave, a walking heresy the caste could not permit to exist. He told her the latter would not ask his question. He told her it would ask only whether she could be erased before the fault in his ledger became a fact the surface pens could hear about, before every unit of threshold stock in every annex learned that the iron caste's guarded rite worked better on a human than on an iron caste son. He told her the truth because she had given him her name, and because she had graded his first sentence partial and been right, and because a physician who had watched a body do the impossible owed that body an honest account of the danger it was in. Ren listened to all of it without moving. When he had finished, she sat on the edge of the warrior's bench, small and pale and marked with the tracery of their rite, and looked at the daylight on the floor of the cell and said, "So the mistake isn't that they put me on the bench." No. No, she looked up at him. The mistake was building a thing this dangerous and being so sure only the right sort of person could ever hold it. That's the mistake, Registrar. The bench was just the day it caught up with them. She stood slowly, the correct speed for the room, and stretched the new frame the way a person stretches after a long stillness, testing the reach of the thing she had been given. You should write that in your record. Right at the top. Aminet carried the record up the ladder that same watch, because he had told himself he would, and because a Selvig who verified and then sat on the verification was no longer a registrar but a conspirator, and he was not yet ready to be that. He filed the fault to the summons chain in the correct form with the correct seals, and he added at the top, in the physician's hand, the caste reserved for findings of consequence, one line: the subject bears no cost from the rite. The frame does not break. Consider before you decide. He did not know, when he filed it, whether the line was a warning to the latter or a plea for the human. He suspected it was both, and that both would be ignored. The latter answered faster than any fault he had ever filed. Before the bright watch closed, the summons came back down not as a review order but as a name, and the name was one every Selvig in the hold knew to keep clear of. Instructor Vashka Drawn of the Iron Caste, Master of Conferrals, the Vantor who decided which warriors the rite would be spent on, and which frames were turned away at the door. Drawn was coming to Meridian Hold on the next transit. Drawn would assess the fault personally. Until Drawn arrived, Cell 9 was sealed under Iron Caste seal, and Registrar Aminet was relieved of the subject and instructed, in the flat language of a caste that did not explain itself to the caste below, to hold himself available and say nothing. Aminet read the order twice. Then he went down to the sealed door of Cell 9, where 2 Iron Caste wardens now stood who had not stood there that morning, and he could not go in, and through the door he heard nothing at all, which from a Vantor cell would have meant a beaten subject, and from this one meant only that Ren was sitting in the daylight being quiet, and he went back up to his vault and sat with the working ledger, and understood that he had done the correct thing, and that the correct thing had almost certainly killed her. Instructor Vashka Drawn had conferred the rite 411 times, and had turned away 900 more, and had buried the 206 candidates whose frames the marrowing had broken all the way through, and in all of it had never once been afraid of a thing on a bench. She did not intend to begin now, for a human. She came into meridian hold on the iron transit with her 2 attending examiners and her conferral blade at her hip, and she went down through the bright halls of the Selvig institution, with the particular contempt the iron caste kept for the caste that kept its records, a contempt worn lightly, the way she wore the conferred strength, a thing so settled into her frame that she no longer felt it as weight. The Selvig scattered from her path. That was correct. She reached the sealed door of cell 9, and the wardens broke the seal, and she went in to look at the fault her caste had summoned her across a system to correct. She had read the record on the transit. The Selvig registrar's line at the top had annoyed her, consider before you decide, as if a records clerk instructed the master of conferrals, and she had read the telemetry beneath it and dismissed the telemetry as a Selvig instrument in error, because Selvig instruments were forever in error and Selvig registrars forever mistaking their errors for revelations. A human could not take the right. That was not caste pride. It was biology, the settled biology of 10,000 conferrals. Threshold stock was fragile, short-lived, weak-framed. The marrowing would have torn the human apart in the first phase. What Drawn expected to find in cell 9 was a dead human, or a dying one, and a Selvig instrument reading a corpse's chemistry as strength, and a fault that resolved itself the way most faults did, by the subject having the decency to expire. She found the human sitting up on the bench in the daylight, whole, quiet, watching her come in with a pair of dark eyes that did the one thing no subject's eyes had ever done to Vashka Drawn in 400 conferrals. They measured her. Drawn stopped 3 paces inside the door. She was aware of her examiners behind her, of the wardens, of the bright cell and the instruments and the small pale thing on the bench, and she was aware, with a prickle at the back of the conferred frame, the old animal part the Rite had made stronger and not quieter, that she had walked into the cell expecting to be the most dangerous thing in it, and that the small pale thing on the bench had watched her make that assumption and had already silently decided it was wrong. Stand, Drawn said. The human stood, slowly, not from weakness. Drawn's own conferred senses, sharper than any Selvig instrument, read the frame in front of her the way she read a candidate, and what they read stopped the next word in her throat. The human stood the way a warrior stood who was holding back. The way Drawn herself stood, in a room she could destroy, keeping the destruction folded away because the room did not yet require it. She knew that stance. She had spent her life inside it. She had never once seen it on anything that was not iron cast, and she was seeing it now on a piece of threshold stock that 6 weeks ago had been hauling waste in the surface pens. You are the fault, Drawn said. I'm Ren, the human said. The fault was in the paperwork. I just woke up in the middle of it. Drawn crossed to the bench. She did not hurry. The iron caste did not hurry, and she would not begin hurrying for a human. But she brought her full conferred attention to bear, the 400 conferral eye that could read a frame's strength from across a hall, and she put that eye on Ren from an arm's length away, and read the human the way she would read a candidate on the morning of a conferral. She had turned away 900 frames. She had passed 411. She knew, better than any living Threnvi, the exact shape of a frame the Rite had filled to the Vantor ceiling, and she knew the shape of the ceiling itself, the wall past which no living strength had ever gone. The human in front of her was past it, not at it. Past it, the way the Selvig instrument had said, and she had not believed, the frame denser than the ceiling, the conducting nerves quicker than the ceiling, and underneath, where every conferred warrior Drawn had ever made carried the long, slow failure of the Rite like a debt coming due, the human carried nothing. No debt. No cost. A frame that had taken the conferral and grown into it and would not, as far as Drawn's own conferred senses could tell, ever have to pay. Vashka Drawn had conferred the Rite 411 times and buried 206, and every one of the buried had been a frame that could not hold the strength, that the strength had broken because the strength was made of breaking. She understood the Rite as a bargain. Power now, cycles later, the warrior's death traded for the warrior's peak. It was the bargain that made the iron cast iron. It was the bargain that made the conferral a right and not a mere procedure, the willingness to pay, the frame strong enough to survive the paying. The human had been handed the bargain by a skipping stylus, and had not paid, and could not be made to pay, and was standing in front of Vashka drawn holding a strength past the ceiling on a leash so short that a piece of threshold stock was choosing, moment to moment, not to harm the master of conferrals who had come to erase it. Drawn stepped back. She did it before she had decided to, and she saw the human note the step of those dark eyes, measuring, and she understood that the human had seen her flinch, and had understood the flinch, and had not moved to use it. That was the moment the contempt died in Vashka drawn and something colder took its place. Not fear. She would not name it fear then or later. But the thing the iron cast was built on, the certainty that strength was theirs, conferred and guarded and rightly held, the crown of the caste order because only the iron frame could bear it. That certainty had just been shown a piece of waste-hauling stock that bore the strength better than she did, and had chosen mercy in a room where drawn would have chosen the blade, and the certainty did not survive the showing. It cracked quietly all the way down, and through the crack Vashka drawn saw for the first time in 400 conferrals the possibility that the thing her caste had built its crown upon was not a truth about the world but a story the strong told to explain why they should rule, and that the story had just walked into a cell and met something stronger that did not want to rule at all. "Restrain it," Drawn said to her examiners, and her voice was steady because she was iron cast and her voice was always steady. "Full conferral grade restraint, and summon the warden. The fault is worse than the record." The examiners moved. They were conferred Vantor, both of them, strong past anything the surface pens could grow, and they came at Ren from either side with the conferral-grade cuffs that could hold a warrior midright. Ren let them. That was the thing Drawn carried out of the cell and could not put down. The human let them cuff her. She watched the two conferred warriors approach, and Drawn watched the human's frame do the small silent calculation. Drawn's own senses read it, the load coming up in the arms and the legs and settling, ready, a wall of strength assembling itself in an instant behind the pale, thin surface. And then she watched the human let the wall stand down, watched her hold out her wrists, watched her be cuffed by two warriors she could have put through the Dalit dome, because being cuffed was, in the human's judgment, the move that kept the most people alive in the next hour, and the human had decided to make that move. "You're doing the right thing," Ren said to Drawn as the cuffs closed. "For you, I mean. If I were what you're afraid of, restraining me would be the smart play. You should keep being afraid of me, just for the right reason." The cuffs locked. The human tested them once, the measurement not the strain, and Drawn saw the load reading spike and knew the cuffs would not hold if the human decided they should not, and knew the human knew it too. "I'm not going to hurt anyone in this hold who doesn't make me. That's the reason. Write that one down too." Drawn did not answer. She turned and left the cell, and in the bright hall outside she stood for a moment among the scattering Selvik and put her hand against the cool wall of the institution, and steadied a frame that had not needed steadying in 400 conferrals, and understood that she had come to correct a fault and had instead been introduced, by a skipping stylus and a piece of threshold stock, to the end of the only order she had ever believed in. The warden of Meridian Hold was Selvik, as the Hold's wardens had always been, and his name was Quarun, and he had run the institution for 60 cycles with the single unshakable conviction that the Hold's purpose was to make the record and keep the caste, and never, under any circumstance, become the story. A Hold that stayed out of the story kept its funding and its autonomy and its warden. A Hold that became the story got a visit from the Concordat's Iron Ministries, and a new warden and a purge of its records, and Quarun had watched two neighboring Holds become the story in his 60 cycles, and had buried both their wardens' careers, and had resolved that Meridian would die of old age before it died of a story. Now he sat in his high office under the dome, with the daylight pouring down and the whole bright institution spread below him. And across the desk sat Instructor Vashka, drawn of the iron caste, and between them on the desk lay Registrar Aminet's record with its one line at the top. And Korun understood that the story had come to his hold anyway, in the smallest possible package, wearing conferral-grade cuffs 3 floors down. "Purge it," Korun said. "The subject, the cohort record, the intake ledger for the shift. A provenance fault of this class, we have protocols. We return the ledger to a clean state. We log the subject as a marrowing failure, expired in the deep phase, which is common enough that no ministry will look twice, and we recover the actual candidate, Carrick, the line master's son, from the surface pens and confer him properly, late but conferred, and the line master is satisfied and the caste is satisfied and the hold is not the story." He folded his hands. "It is a clean purge, Instructor. I have run it before for lesser faults. The subject expires, the record heals, the hold survives. This is what we do." Drawn looked at him for a long moment. "You have not seen it," she said. "I have read the record. You have read a Selvik registrar's numbers, Warden, which you and I have both spent our lives distrusting. I have stood in the cell." Drawn leaned forward, and Korun saw, with a warden's instinct for the temperature of a room, that something had happened to the master of conferrals in that cell, something that had not happened to her in 400 conferrals, because the contempt she had carried through his bright halls on the way in was gone, and had not been replaced by the boredom the iron caste wore in its place. It had been replaced by care. Vashka Drawn was being careful, and Vashka Drawn was never careful because nothing had ever required it. The subject is past the ceiling, not at it. Past it and paying nothing, and I could not read the top of the frame because the subject would not show me the top of the frame. It chose what to show me. It chose to be cuffed. Do you understand what I am telling you, Warden? Your clean purge assumes the subject can be purged. I stood an arm's length from it, and I am telling you that the subject is in those cuffs because it decided to be, and that it will leave those cuffs the moment it decides the cuffs are the wrong move, and that nothing in this hold, not the wardens, not my examiners, not me, will have any say in the deciding." Korun was quiet. "Then we do it in the deep phase drug," he said more slowly. "In the food. It does not have to know." "It will know." Drawn said it flatly. "It knew the registrar's sincerity was partial and graded it to his face. It read my frame before I read its. It watched 2 conferred warriors approach with cuffs and calculated the whole cell in the time it took them to cross it, and then it chose the outcome that spilled the least, and the outcome it chose was to let us win the hour. Warden, hear the shape of what I am telling you. We are not deciding whether to purge the subject. The subject is deciding whether to let us try. And the moment we try, the moment it reads a poisoned meal or a warden coming in the dark, we will have told it that the least spilling move is no longer the one it has been making, and it will make a different one. And I have seen the top of no other frame that frightens me, but I have not seen the top of that one, and I do not want to see it in my hold." Korun did not run the clean purge. He was a Selvik warden of 60 cycles, and he heard, in the master of conferral's flat and careful voice, the one thing his whole career had trained him to hear coming, the sound of a hold about to become the story. So he did what a warden did when the clean move was closed to him. He reached for a slower one. He would not kill the human, because Drawn had convinced him the killing might not take and might make the story worse. He would contain it, and study it, and buy time, and use the time to build a version of events the ministries could accept. The subject would be logged not as expired but as detained, a provenance anomaly under Selvik study, a phrase so gray the ministries would file it and forget it. Carrick, the line master's son, would be recovered from the pens and conferred properly and quietly, and the line master's honor would be repaired, which mattered, because the line master was Vantor, and Vantor honor became stories faster than anything else in the Concordat. And the human would be studied in the bright cells of the hold until the Selvik understood how it had done the impossible thing, and once they understood it, the understanding itself would tell them how to end it cleanly, or how to bury it, or how to turn a heresy into a footnote. That was the warden's plan, and it was a good plan for a warden, and it lasted exactly as long as it took the iron caste to hear that a piece of threshold stock was wearing the Rite better than a line master's son. The story did not wait for the ministries. It never did. It went down the informal ladder, the ladder of who saw what, the two junior attendants, the wardens on the cell door, the Selvig who had scattered from drawn in the halls and off the hold on a labor transit, and out into the surface pens where the threshold stock hauled waste, and up through the iron caste's own channels. And within 4 bright watches, the thing Warden Korun most feared had happened. Everyone who mattered knew, and everyone told the story their own way, and the hold had lost control of what the fault meant before it had finished deciding what to do about the fault. The line master came first. His name was Sevit Karak, and he was Vantor to the marrow, and he arrived at Meridian Hold on a private iron transit with a grievance that had already curdled into something older and worse than grievance. His son had been sent to the pens. That alone was an injury the caste would spend a generation avenging. But the injury that had turned Sevit Karak's face to stone was not the pens. It was that the Rite meant for his son, the Rite the Karak line had carried for 11 generations, the Rite that made them who they were had been spent on a human, and the human had taken it better. Not survived it, taken it better. The caste's whole claim to the crown of the order rested on one silent premise, that the iron frame alone could bear the strength, and a skipping stylus had just spent that premise on a waste hauler and proven it false, and Sevit Karak had come to the hold to see the proof destroyed before the proof could be believed. He did not want the human studied. He wanted it gone, and the record gone, and the story strangled, and he had the caste wait to demand it, and the caste rage to mean it. Warden Korun sat across his desk from a second iron caste Vantor in as many watches, and where Drawn had come carrying care, Sevit Karak came carrying a certainty so total, and so threatened that it had become a kind of madness. And Korun understood that his slow good plan was now caught between a master of conferrals, who said the human could not be safely killed, and a line master who would burn the hold down if it were not. Aminet was returned to the subject on the warden's order, because the warden's slow plan required the human studied, and the human, asked through the sealed door whom it would permit to conduct the study, had said one name. The registrar, Ren said, Aminet him or no one. And if you send someone else in his place and tell me it's him, I'll know. The way I knew the first thing he ever said to me was only partly true. So don't. So Aminet came back down to cell 9, past the conferral grade wardens, into the bright cell where the human sat in her cuffs in the daylight, and he set up the physician's stations again with his own hands, and the two of them resumed the strange, careful work of measuring a thing that had no category, while 3 floors up a warden and a line master decided whether she would be allowed to go on existing. She was heavier in the frame than she had been at the wake assessment. The Rite was not finished with her. That was the first thing Aminet's instruments told him, and the first thing that frightened him anew, because a Vantor conferral reached its ceiling and stopped. The frame filled to the wall of what it could bear and could take no more, and the taking no more was the beginning of the long cost. Ren's frame had not stopped. 4 watches past the marrowing, the density was still climbing, slower but climbing, and the nerve conduction with it, and the recovery with it, and Aminet sat at his panel and watched the numbers rise past gridlines the Selvig had drawn as the outer wall of the conceivable, and understood that he was no longer measuring a strength. He was measuring a slope, and a slope did not have a ceiling. A slope had only the length of the climb. It's still going up, Ren said. She could not read his instruments, but she had learned to read his face, which she said was easier. Isn't it? Yes, Aminet said. He had decided in the long watches that he would not lie to her even in the partial way that had earned her grade. It cost him something to say it plainly. The Rite is not finished with you. A warrior's conferral ends. It reaches the frame's limit and stops and begins to charge its price. Yours has not reached a limit. I do not know that it has one. I am watching your frame grow stronger by the watch. At no cost I can find, and I do not know where it ends. And I am telling you that plainly because you asked me to and because you should know it before they do. Ren was quiet for a moment. Does that make it better or worse for me? She said. Up there. Worse. Aminet did not soften it. The warden hoped to study you until the study told him how to end you. The line master wants you ended now. And every watch your numbers climb, the study tells the warden nothing except that you are further past ending than you were the watch before. You are making the slow plan impossible by existing at the rate you exist. Soon the only plan left will be the line master's, and the line master's plan is the blade. And you're telling me this, Ren said. Why, you're their registrar, you keep their record. Warning the subject isn't in your protocol. No, Aminet said. It is not. He looked at the human in the cuffs in the daylight, small and pale and growing quietly stronger than anything his caste had ever made. And he found that the answer was simple and that he had known it since the wake, since she graded his first sentence partial and was right. I have spent 30 cycles keeping the record of a rite that breaks the frames it is spent on, he said. 206 of them broke all the way through, in the marrowing, on benches like the one you woke on, and I logged every one as a candidate lost and filed it and slept. I told myself the rite was necessary and the breaking was the price, and the price was not mine to question, because I am Selvig, and the questioning is not our work. And then a stylus skipped, and the rite was spent on a frame it could not break, and for the first time in 30 cycles I am watching the marrowing do what it was always supposed to do, make strength, without the breaking, without the price, without the 206. You are the proof, Ren, that the price was never necessary. It was only necessary for them, and I find that I would rather keep an honest record of you than a clean one of my caste. Ren looked at him for a long moment, the counting eyes gone still. That's the first thing you've said, she told him. That wasn't even partly for them. She flexed her cuffed hands, the measurement, not the strain. All right, registrar, then keep the honest record. Because I think it's going to be the only true thing in this building before long, and somebody's going to need it. But they tried to strip it out of her on the 9th watch. Aminet was not told beforehand. That was the warden's decision, made in a room Aminet was not in, under pressure from a line master Aminet had never met. The Selvig had one procedure that could, in theory, act against a conferral, a counter-rite, developed generations back for the rare candidate whose marrowing began to run away, whose frame took the strength too fast and threatened to tear itself apart on the excess. The counter-rite was a controlled quenching. It flooded the frame with the signals that told a body to stop rebuilding, to settle, to spend down the surplus and return toward what it had been. It had been used a handful of times in the hold's history, always on Vantor, always to save a candidate the Rite was killing. It had never been turned on a subject to unmake a conferral on purpose. But the warden's physicians, pressed for any plan that was not the blade, had proposed it. Quench the human's runaway frame, drive the strength back down, return the waste hauler to something near a waste hauler, and let the whole fault settle into a footnote. They put it in the deep phase line, the same feed that had carried the marrowing drug, while Ren slept. Aminet learned of it only when his panel, monitoring cell 9 through the watch as it now always did, showed him the quenching signature blooming through the human's telemetry, and he came up out of his chair with a Selvig's rare shout already in his throat, because he knew the counter-rite and he knew what it did to a frame that was still climbing, and he thought, in the first cold instant, that they had killed her. They had not killed her, they had fed her. Aminet stood at his panel and watched the human's frame take the quenching the way it had taken the Rite, all of it, and asked for more. The counter-rite flooded her with the signals to stop, to settle, to spend down, and her frame read the flood not as an instruction but as a load, one more stress to adapt to, one more injury to close and grow past, and it turned the quenching into fuel. The density, which had been climbing slowly, jumped. The nerve conduction jumped with it. Whatever the counter-Rite touched, the human's body strengthened against, the way a frame worked against a weight, and by the time the physicians 3 floors up understood that their quenching was not quenching anything and cut the feed, they had driven the human further past the ceiling in 1 watch than the marrowing had driven her in 4. She woke in the middle of it. Aminette watched her wake all at once and quiet, as always, and watched her feel the wrongness in the line, and watched her understand, in the space of a breath, exactly what had been tried and exactly how it had failed. And she lay on the bench in the daylight in her cuffs, with the strength of it roaring up through her frame past every wall the Selvig had ever drawn, and she did not break the cuffs, and she did not tear the cell apart, and she did not so much as raise her voice. "Registrar," she said to the dark rectangle of the observation glass, knowing he was there, "tell them to stop trying to make me weaker. It doesn't work. And every time they try, they teach my body that this building is a threat, and my body is very good at learning." A pause. "I'm holding a lot back right now. I want you to understand that I'm choosing to. Tell them that too, in words they'll believe. Because the next thing they try, I might not be asleep for, and I would very much like to keep not hurting anyone." Aminette keyed the channel. His hand was not quite steady. "They hear you," he said. "I will make them hear you." He made them hear her by carrying the 9th watch telemetry up to the warden's office himself, unsummoned, past the wardens who did not dare stop a registrar carrying a physician's finding, and laying it on the desk between Warden Korun and the line master Sevit Karek, and saying, in the flat voice the Selvig reserved for the truths a caste did not want, exactly what the counter-Rite had done. "You tried to strip the conferral," Aminette said. "You drove it deeper. Every action this hold takes against the subject's frame, the frame converts to strength. I have the record. It is not an opinion. It is the 9th watch telemetry, and it says that your quenching made her stronger than the marrowing did, and that she woke in the middle of it and chose, Warden chose, line master, not to leave the cell. You have in your hold a being that grows stronger from everything you do to harm it, and does not harm you back. And the only variable you still control is whether you keep giving it reasons." Sevit Karek stood. The conferred frame of a Vantor line master filled the warden's bright office, and the rage in it was the rage of a caste that had built its crown on a lie, and had just been handed the proof of the lie by a records clerk. "You speak of it," Karek said, "as though it were owed consideration. It is a fault in a ledger wearing my lines right. It is threshold stock. It hauls waste. The crown of the concordat does not negotiate with the strength in a waste hauler's frame. It removes the frame, and the right returns to those who are raised to bear it, and the order holds. That is not cruelty, clerk. That is the order. The order has held 10,000 cycles because the strong hold it, and no accident of your caste's careless ledger will unmake, in a single generation, what the marrowing built across all of them." Aminette looked at the line master. He was an old Selvig, and he had spent his life below the iron caste, keeping their record and burying their dead, and he had never once in 30 cycles said to a Vantor's face the thing he had come to understand in a bright cell 3 floors down. He said it now, quietly, because it was true, and because Wren had asked him to keep the honest record, and this was part of it. "The order held," Aminette said, "because the strongest thing in every room was iron caste, and the iron caste made the rule that the strongest should hold the crown. That is the whole of it, line master. Strip away the rights and the generations, and it is that simple. You rule because you are strongest, and you say it is right that the strongest rule because you are strongest. And now, 3 floors below us, sits the strongest thing your caste has ever made, and it is not iron caste, and it does not want the crown, and it will not take it, and it will not let you take it back. Your order does not have a place for a thing stronger than you that declines to rule. It never needed one. And the reason your face is stone, line master, is that you have already understood what that missing place means for everything you are." Sevet Carrick left the hold that watch, and the leaving was worse than the arriving, because a Vantor line master who left without his satisfaction did not go home to grieve. He went home to gather. Warden Corun knew it. He sat in his high office after the line master's transit had gone and watched the daylight cross the dome, and understood that his slow plan was dead, killed by a counter-right he had approved against his own better instinct, and that the fault in a Selvig ledger had grown, in 11 watches, from a record's error into a matter of caste honor, and that caste honor did not resolve in offices. It resolved in the open, in front of witnesses, with the strong caste demonstrating on the body of the weak that the order still held. Sevet Carrick had gone to gather the iron caste, and the iron caste would come to Meridian Hold, and they would take the human out into the bright conditioning hall under the dome where the whole institution could see, and they would enter there, publicly, correctly, so that every unit of threshold stock in every pen would learn the same lesson at once. The right is ours, the strength is ours, and what the accident gave you, the order takes back. It was, Corun understood, a very old solution to a very old problem, and it had worked for 10,000 cycles, and it had exactly one flaw, which was that it had never before been tried on something stronger than the caste attempting it. He summoned Drawn. He summoned Aminet. He sat the master of conferrals and the registrar across his desk in the failing daylight, and did a thing no warden of Meridian Hold had done in its history, which was ask the 2 castes below him what he should do. The line master will return within 4 watches with a conferral cohort, Corun said. Full iron caste. He has the standing to demand a public correction, and I do not have the standing to refuse it. When they come, they will take the subject into the great hall, under the dome before the whole hold, and they will do to it what the order requires. And I have read the registrar's telemetry, and I have heard the master of conferrals say the subject cannot be safely killed, and so I am asking you both, plainly, caste be damned. What happens in that hall? Drawn answered first. She had been to the cell twice more since the wake, on her own initiative, and had stood at the glass and watched the human hold the surplus down, and something in the master of conferrals had been settling toward a conclusion she did not like and could not unsee. What happens in the hall, Drawn said, is whatever the human decides happens. That is the whole of my answer, Warden, and I have conferred the right 400 times, and I have never given a worse one, because it is the truth, and the truth is intolerable. A conferral cohort is the strongest force the Concordat can field. 12 iron caste warriors at the height of the Rite. I have led such a cohort. There is nothing in the settled galaxy it cannot break. And I am telling you that, if you put that cohort in a hall with the thing in cell 9, the outcome is not the cohort's to determine. The human will read the hall the way it read my frame across a cell, and it will calculate the least spilling path through 12 conferred warriors the way it calculated the least spilling path through my 2 examiners, and then it will do exactly that, and not one increment more, and we will all learn together where the top of the frame is. She paused. And I do not think, Warden, that Sevet Carrick has understood that the public correction he is about to demand is a public correction of himself. Then we do not let them into the hall, Aminet said. I cannot refuse a line master a caste correction, Corun said. The refusal itself becomes the story. A Selvig warden shielding a heretic augment from the iron caste. The ministries would replace me before the transit docked, and my replacement would open the hall to the cohort on his first watch, and we would arrive at the same hall with a worse warden. I am not proposing you refuse them the hall, Aminet said. I am proposing you ask the subject what it wants to do in it. The office was silent. You would ask the fault, Corun said slowly, how it would like to be corrected. I would ask the strongest being in this hold, Aminet said, which of the outcomes it is capable of, it intends to choose, because it is going to choose one, Warden. Instructor Drawn is right. Nothing that happens in that hall will be ours to decide once the cohort is in it. The only decision still available to this institution is whether we walk into the hall as the human's enemy or as the one caste that told it the truth on the way there. And I know which of those the human will remember, because I have watched it remember everything and grade everyone and spend 11 watches choosing, over and over at real cost to itself, the path that spills the least of us. That is not a weapon in Cell 9, Warden. Instructor Drawn has been trying to tell you, and the word keeps sliding off you because your caste does not have it. It is not a weapon. It is a person who could be a weapon and is choosing, hour by hour, in a building that keeps trying to poison her, not to be one. And the line master is about to walk 12 reasons into a hall and demand she reconsider. Warden Corrin sat for a long time in the failing light. "Go down," he said at last to Aminette. "Ask her, not as the warden's registrar, as whatever you have become to her in that cell. Ask her what she will do when the cohort comes and bring me the answer, and I will decide then whether I am the warden who opens the hall or the warden who is replaced. And instructor," he looked at Drawn, "you have led a conferral cohort. If it comes to the hall, where will you stand?" Vashka Drawn was iron caste. She had conferred the Rite 400 times and buried 206, and never once been afraid of a thing on a bench. She looked at the warden, and then at the old Selvik registrar who had said aloud in a caste office the thing she had been circling for 11 watches, and she gave the answer that ended her career and did not, when she examined it later, cost her a moment's regret. "With the truth," Drawn said, "wherever the registrar puts it." Wren had counted the cell 400 times, and she knew it better than the people who had built it. She knew the daylight came through the high slot windows on a slow arc that took the whole bright watch, and that at the middle of the watch it laid a bar of warmth across the end of the bench where she could reach it with her cuffed hands. And she knew this because she had spent 6 years in the surface pens learning to find the one warm place in every cold room. And the pens had taught her that a body kept whatever small comforts it could reach, because it did not know when it would reach another. She knew the sound of the door mechanism, the sound of the feed line, the sound of Aminette's slower step against the warden's heavier one. She knew the frame she was in now was not the frame she had gone to sleep in, and she knew it more precisely than the machines did, because the machines measured the strength from outside and she felt it from within. A vast quiet reserve banked up behind the thin pale surface of her, growing by the watch, patient as water behind a wall. She was 19. She had been born in a labor pen on a station she had never learned the name of, to a mother who hauled the same waste Wren had hauled, and she had grown up small and quick and watched, because in the pens the ones who were watched were the ones who lasted, and the ones who made noise were the ones who were noticed. And being noticed was the beginning of most bad things. She had learned, before she learned anything else, that strength she could not hide was strength that would be taken from her and used against her, and that the only power that lasted in a pen was the power no one knew you had. She had carried that lesson up onto a warrior's bench without meaning to, and it had turned out to be the only lesson that mattered. Because she understood, in a way the Threnvi with all their rights did not, exactly what had been put into her frame. They thought it was a weapon. She could feel that it was not in itself. It was a reserve. A vast, patient, growing reserve of the one thing the pens had taught her never to reveal, and the Threnvi had made the catastrophic error of pouring an ocean of it into the one kind of creature raised from birth to hide exactly this. A Vantor warrior took the Rite and wore it drawn, because the Vantor had been raised to believe that visible strength was the crown of the world. Wren had been raised to believe that visible strength was a mark on your back. And so where a warrior would have risen off the bench roaring, testing the new power against every wall, she had risen quiet and hidden it and let them cuff her, and spent 11 watches convincing a building full of frightened predators that the ocean behind her eyes was a puddle they could manage. Because a puddle they could manage was a puddle they might, eventually, decide to leave alone, and an ocean they could not manage was an ocean they would have to try to drain, and she had watched them try, with the counter-Rite. and she had felt what her body did with the trying. That was the thing she was most afraid of, alone in the cell in the bar of daylight. Not the cohort Aminette had warned her was coming. The cohort was a problem she could already see the shape of, and problems with shapes did not frighten her. The pens had cured her of fearing anything she could see coming. What frightened her was her own frame, and what it did with a threat, and how good it was getting at it. Every time the building came at her, her body answered by growing stronger, and she could feel that the growing had no top to it that she had found, and she understood that there was a version of the next watches in which the building pushed her frame past the last of her restraint, not her anger. She did not have the Vantor's anger, and would not give the building the courtesy of it, but past the point where holding the ocean back cost more than she had to spend. And she did not want to find out what the ocean did when she stopped holding it. She thought it might not stop where she wanted it to. She thought that might be the one thing in the cell she could not outcount. So when the door mechanism sounded its familiar sequence, and Aminette's slower step came down the corridor alone, unhurried, and the wardens let him pass, Wren was already sitting up in the bar of daylight with her decision made, because she had spent 6 years in the pens learning to make the decision before the room forced it on her, so that whatever happened next would be a thing she chose, and not a thing that was done to her. "They're coming," she said before he reached the glass. "The strong ones, all of them this time, in the open where everyone can watch. That's the plan, isn't it? Make an example. Show the pens what happens to the waist hauler who wore the crown." Aminette stopped at the glass. She heard him not answer, which was its own answer, and had been for 11 watches. "I'm not going to fight them, Registrar," Wren said. "I want you to understand that before I say the rest, because the rest is going to sound like a plan for a fight, and it isn't." She turned her face up toward the dark rectangle where he stood. "I've been in a room where the strong ones make an example before. Not this strong, but the shape's the same, and I know how it goes if I do what they expect. If I fight, I win. I can feel that I win, and that's the worst part, because winning means 12 of them don't leave that hall, and then I'm exactly what the line master needs me to be. A heretic augment that killed a conferral cohort. Then the story writes itself. Then the pens don't learn that the crown was always a lie. They learn that the waist hauler was a monster, and the iron caste died holding the line against the monster, and the order gets stronger, not weaker, because I gave it a monster to be afraid of." She shook her head slowly. "I'm not going to give them that. I've been not giving people that my whole life." "Then what?" Aminette said. His voice through the channel was very quiet. "If you will not fight the cohort, and the cohort will not be stopped from entering the hall, what will you do, Wren, when 12 conferred warriors come to make an example of you in front of your whole world?" Wren looked at the bar of daylight on the end of the bench, the one warm place in the cold room, the thing the pens had taught her to always find. "I'm going to let them start," she said. "In front of everyone. I'm going to let the whole hold watch the strongest warriors they've got come at me with everything the Rite gave them. And then I'm going to end it in one move, without killing a single one of them, and I'm going to make sure every unit of threshold stock in every pen sees that too." She met the dark rectangle of the glass. "Because the lesson the line master wants to teach is what happens to the weak who reach above their caste, and the only way to unteach it, the only way, is to be the strongest thing in the room and choose to be gentle in the open, where they can't edit it out. The pens have to see mercy from the top of the strength, Registrar, not from the bottom. Mercy from the bottom is just losing quietly. Mercy from the top is the whole crown coming off." She flexed her cuffed hands, the measurement, not the strain, the reserve moving behind the pale surface like a tide. "So here's what I need from you, and it's the only thing. When it's over, when I've done it and they've seen it, I need your honest record to already exist. Written down, sealed, somewhere the line master can't reach. Because they'll try to say it didn't happen the way it happened. They always do. And your record is going to be the thing that says, no, it happened exactly like this. The strongest being in the hall put down 12 warriors and let all 12 of them live on purpose, where the whole world could see. Write that one before it happens, Registrar, so it's already true when they try to make it a lie. Aminet wrote the record that night and sealed it, and did not put it in the hold's archive where a line master's writ could reach. He put it in the physician's vault, under the old Selvic protection that predated the caste order itself. The finding of a physician, sealed to the caste of physicians, unreachable by any warrior's authority, because the physicians had won that protection in a plague 10,000 cycles gone, when the iron caste had wanted to bury a finding that would have shamed it, and the Selvic had refused, and the refusal had cost lives and been honored ever since. It was the one lock in the whole Concordat that the crown could not pick. Aminet had never had cause to use it. He used it now for a human, and he wrote the record honest and complete. The fault in the ledger, the frame that took the Rite and paid nothing, the counter-Rite that fed her, the 11 watches of a strength past every ceiling held on the shortest leash he had ever seen, and at the top, where he had once written "Consider before you decide," he wrote a different line. What follows, the subject chose. Remember that it could have chosen otherwise and did not. Then he sealed it, and set it beyond the reach of the crown, and went to tell the warden what the human intended to do in the hall. The line master returned on the 4th watch, as Drawn had said he would, and he did not come alone. He brought the conferral cohort, 12 iron-cast warriors at the height of the Rite, the strongest force the Concordat could field, their conferred frames filling the hold's bright receiving hall so completely that the Selvic staff pressed themselves to the walls to let them pass. He brought his own line guard, and the writ of caste correction stamped with authorities that Warden Korun could not refuse without becoming the story. And he brought one more, a thing Korun had not expected and understood, the moment he saw it, to be the line master's masterstroke, and though the line master could not yet know it, the line master's undoing. He brought a witness of record. The Concordat's ministries kept a caste for this too, the caste of the witnessing, whose work was to record the great corrections of the order and render them to the whole settled galaxy, so that every world under the crown would see the order enforced and be reminded of it. A public correction of a heresy augment, a conferral cohort putting down a waste hauler who had worn the Rite, Sevit Carrick wanted that seen. He wanted it seen everywhere, in every pen and every hall and every world, the full weight of the iron caste falling on the accident that had insulted it, so that the insult would be buried under the spectacle of its own correction. He had brought a witness of record to make the example as large as the fear the accident had caused. He had brought, to the one confrontation the order could not afford to have seen, the apparatus to make certain the whole galaxy saw it. Warden Korun understood the shape of it standing in his own receiving hall, and he understood that his last decision had just been made for him, not by the line master, but by the human 3 floors down who had said, "I'm going to make sure every unit of threshold stock in every pen sees that too." The human had asked for witnesses. The line master had brought them. The order was about to record its own correction and broadcast it to every world it ruled, and if the correction went the way the line master expected, the crown would be reinforced across the galaxy in a single watch. And if it went the way the human intended, the crown would come off in front of the same audience, and there would be no editing it, because the witnessing caste recorded true or it did not record. That was its own ancient protection. Another lock the crown could not pick, because the crown had needed it honest for 10,000 cycles of enforcing itself. Korun found Aminet at his side. He had not heard the registrar approach. "He has brought the witnessing," Korun said quietly. "He means to broadcast the correction to every world." "Yes," Aminet said. "You already knew." "The subject asked for witnesses," Aminet said. "I did not know how she would get them. Now I do. The line master has brought her exactly what she needs and believes he is bringing it for himself. She saw this shape before either of us. I think she saw it the watch she woke." He was quiet a moment. She has been in a room where the strong make an example before, Warden. She told me. She knows the one thing that turns an example inside out, and it is witnesses, and the line master could not resist bringing them, because a correction no one sees does not repair honor, and honor was the only thing he came for. She counted on his honor to hand her the galaxy. And it has. Korun looked at the conferral cohort filling his bright hall, and at the witnessing caste setting its apparatus, and at the line master standing stone-faced in the certainty of a correction he had already, in his mind, completed, and the warden of Meridian Hold made the last decision of the career he had spent 60 cycles protecting. "Open the great hall," Korun said. "Under the dome, full daylight. Let the witnessing set wherever it likes, refuse them nothing, the more they see the better." He turned to Aminet. "And bring the subject up yourself, not the wardens, you, however she wishes to come." He paused, and something old and tired and finally honest moved across the Selvik warden's face. "I have spent 60 cycles keeping this hold out of the story, Registrar. It seems I am to be the warden who put it in the largest story the Order has ever told. I find I would rather be that warden with a clean conscience than the other one with a clean record. Go, bring her up." The great hall of Meridian Hold stood at the center of the institution under the highest point of the dome, and at the middle of the bright watch, the daylight came straight down through the clear crown of the dome, and filled the whole vast space with a clean and shadowless light, and it was into that light that they brought the human to be corrected. The witnessing caste had set its apparatus in a ring. The Hold's Selvik staff lined the high galleries, permitted to watch because the line master wanted witnesses of every caste to the Order's enforcement. The conferral cohort stood at the center of the hall in the shadowless light, 12 iron-cast warriors at the height of the Rite, and before them stood Sevit Karak, and beside the cohort, where the master of conferrals stood at every conferral, stood Vashka Drawn, because Drawn had led such cohorts, and the line master had assumed she would lead this one, and Drawn had let him assume it, and had taken her place beside the 12, and had said nothing. They brought Ren into the light, and the whole hall saw her, and the whole galaxy would see her. Small, pale, thin the way the pens grew their stock, marked all over with the fine dark tracery of the Rite, walking into the center of the shadowless light beside an old Selvik registrar, wearing no restraint at all. That was Korun's last quiet defiance, or Aminet's, or perhaps the human's own request. She came into the hall uncuffed. The line master's stone face registered it, the wrongness of a correction that walked in free, but he could not order her restrained now without admitting to the witnessing caste that the fault could not be safely held, and so he let it pass, and did not understand that the uncuffed walk was the first line of the record the human was writing in front of the galaxy. "I am not being held. I am here because I chose to be." Ren stopped in the center of the light. She looked at the 12 conferred warriors and at the line master and up at the Selvik in the galleries, and at the ring of the witnessing apparatus that was, she knew, carrying her image to every world under the crown, to every pen, to every hall, to the surface she had been hauled up from and every surface like it. She did not look for a way out. Aminet, standing at her side until the last moment, saw her do the thing she always did, the thing the pens had taught her. She counted the room, corner to corner, the 12 and the line master and the exits and the galleries and the witnessing ring, and then she went still, the vast reserve banked up quiet behind the thin pale surface of her, and she let the room see her be unafraid. "You should go now, Registrar," she said to Aminet low under the hall's hush. "Whatever happens, you don't want to be standing next to me when it starts, and the record's sealed." "Beyond the crown's reach," Aminet said, "where no warrior's writ can touch it." "Then it's already true," Ren said. "Good, go." Aminet went. He climbed to the gallery and stood among the Selvik, an old registrar who had kept the record for 30 cycles, and he watched the human he had measured stand alone in the shadowless light at the center of her whole world, and he understood that he had done the one thing his caste existed to do, and had never, in all its careful history, done for a creature the Order had thrown away. He had made her true before they could make her a lie. The line master lifted his hand. "The Rite is the iron castes," SciFiNarration said, and his voice carried through the great hall and out through the witnessing to every world under the crown. It was so before the Threnvi left the birth mud, and it is so now, and it will be so when this accident is corrected and forgotten. What the careless ledger gave, the Order takes back. Let every world see the taking and remember the shape of it, and never again mistake an accident for a right. He looked at the small, pale thing in the light, the waist hauler wearing his lines right, and there was no cruelty in his face, only the terrible certainty of a caste that had never once had to test its story against something stronger than itself. Cohort. Correct the fault. And the 12 conferred warriors, the strongest force the Concordat could field, moved on the human all at once, in the full shadowless daylight, in front of the whole watching galaxy. Ren let them start. That was the thing the witnessing carried to every world, the thing that could not be edited because the witnessing recorded true or not at all. The human let them start. She stood in the center of the light and let 12 iron caste warriors at the height of the Rite close the distance. Let them commit. Let the whole galaxy see that she had not moved first, had not struck first, had given the Order every chance to be something other than what it was about to be. She waited until the correction was no longer a threat but an act, until the first of the conferred frames was on her with all the strength the Marrowing had ever conferred. And then Ren, who had spent 6 years in the pens learning to make the decision before the room forced it on her, and 11 watches convincing a building that the ocean behind her eyes was a puddle, and a whole life not giving the strong the monster they needed her to be, moved once. Afterward, the witnessing caste would slow the record for the ministries, because at the true speed the eye could not hold it, and even slowed it was hard to believe. She did not strike the first warrior, she took him. The conferred frame came at her with the full committed weight of the Rite behind it, and Ren stepped inside the weight the way a small thing steps inside a large thing's reach, and she caught the striking limb and did not break it. The witnessing showed this, showed the hand close and the enormous load bloom in her arm and the limb not break, held, redirected, and she used the warrior's own committed strength to turn him past her and set him down, hard, on the bright floor of the hall, stunned and whole. 1. Before the second warrior had finished the step he had begun when the first committed. Then she was among them. There is a way that a small quick thing moves through a group of large committed things when the small thing is stronger than all of them, and has decided that none of them will die, and no caste in the Concordat had ever seen it, because no caste had ever produced a thing that was both stronger than the iron caste and unwilling to kill. The cohort had trained against strength. They had trained against speed. They had never trained against restraint at the top of the strength, because restraint at the top of the strength was a thing their whole order insisted could not exist. The strong ruled, the strong took. The strong did not hold back. That was what made them the crown, and so 12 iron caste warriors at the height of the Rite discovered together, in the space of a few breaths under the shadowless light, that they had no answer for a thing that could break them and chose, each time, at the last increment, not to. She unmade the cohort without unmaking a single warrior in it. She took the second by the drive of his own charge and folded him to the floor beside the first. She caught the third's conferral blade in her bare hand. The witnessing showed the edge close in her palm and not cut, the load in her grip past anything the blade's forging had accounted for, and she turned it aside and set the third down disarmed. She moved through the fourth and the fifth as if their conferred speed were a current she was simply faster than, never striking to harm, always to end the warrior's part in the fight. A limb pinned, a drive redirected, a frame set down whole and stunned and out. The witnessing carried it all to every world under the crown. The small pale thing moving through the strongest force the Concordat could field, and the force coming apart in her hands like a knot untied, and no blood, no breaking, no killing, only the systematic, gentle, absolute removal of 12 warriors from a fight they had been certain was a correction. It ended with the 12th. She set him down beside the others in the shadowless daylight, and then she was standing alone in the center of the ring of them. 12 conferred warriors on the bright floor, every one of them alive, every one of them conscious, every one of them whole, and the vast reserve behind her thin, pale surface was. Aminet in the gallery could not read her frame from there, but he did not need to. He had watched the whole thing at the true speed and then again slowed, and he knew what he had seen. She had spent almost nothing. The ocean was barely disturbed. She had put down the crown's strongest cohort with a fraction of what she held, and the fraction had been enough, and the rest of it she had kept banked and quiet and hidden, the way the pens had taught her, because the strength no one knows you have is the only strength that lasts. The great hall was silent. The witnessing recorded the silence and carried it to every world. Sevet Carrick stood at the edge of the ring of his fallen cohort, and his stone face had come apart, and what was underneath it was the thing Aminet had named in the warden's office, and the line master had understood then and could not bear now. The missing place in the order, the shape of a thing stronger than the iron caste that declined to rule, and the crown coming off in front of the whole galaxy because the strongest being in the hall had put down the correction and let it live. He drew his own conferral blade. He was a line master. 11 generations of the Rite ran in his frame, and he was old and strong and certain, and the certainty was the last thing he had, and he could not stand in front of the witnessing and the galaxy and be the caste whose crown had just come off, and so he did the only thing the order had left him. He moved on the human himself, blade drawn, to finish the correction his cohort had failed, so that the record would at least show the line master falling with the order in his hand and not standing whole beside its ruin. Ren watched him come. She did not move to meet him. She let him come, the way she had let the cohort come, and the witnessing carried it to every world, the line master with his ancestral blade, and the small pale thing standing still in the center of the light, unafraid, unmoving, giving even the line master every chance to be something other than what he had chosen. He crossed the last of the distance with the full committed strength of 11 generations, the blade rising, and Aminet in the gallery could not breathe. And Ren took the blade out of the air. She caught his wrist as she had caught the cohort, the enormous quiet load blooming in her small hand, and she stopped 11 generations of the Rite dead in the shadowless light, the blade a hand's breadth from her, held, going nowhere. And she looked up at the line master over the stopped blade, and she did not break his wrist, and she did not take the blade and turn it on him, and she did not do any of the things the order would have done, that the order had always done, that the order believed with its whole heart were the only thing strength was for. "You raised your whole caste," Ren said, quietly, into the silence the witnessing carried to every world, to believe that the strongest thing in the room has the right to rule it, and you built a right to make sure the strongest thing was always one of yours. She held the blade stopped in the air, gently, the way she had closed her hand on the dynamometer, the way she had learned to hold a smaller creature she did not intend to harm. You were so sure of it that you never asked the only question that mattered. You never asked what would happen the day the strongest thing in the room was someone your rule had thrown away, someone who grew up small in a pen, learning that the whole point of being strong is that you don't have to prove it on anyone weaker than you. She eased the stopped blade down and out of his hand and let it fall to the bright floor between them and did not touch him again. "I'm stronger than your whole caste, line master. Your own right made me stronger, and I'm not going to rule anyone. That's the correction. That's what every world is watching, not that the waste hauler was a monster. That the waste hauler was the strongest thing in your order, and looked at your crown and set it down. The order did not fall in the hall. Orders do not fall in halls. They fall afterward slowly in 1,000 rooms at once, when the story that held them up stops being believed. But the hall was where the believing stopped. The witnessing had carried it true, because the witnessing recorded true or not at all, and there was no editing what every world had seen. The conferral cohort untied like a knot and every warrior living. The line master's blade stopped in a bare hand and set down, the small pale thing from the pen standing whole in the shadowless light, saying, "I'm not going to rule anyone." The line master had brought the witnessing to make the correction large. He had succeeded. The correction was the largest thing the order had told in 10,000 cycles, and it corrected the wrong thing. It corrected the order's foundational lie in front of every creature the lie had ever ruled. In the surface pens, the threshold stock watched. On 100 worlds, the low castes watched, the labor pools, the waste haulers, the ones the order had thrown away and set to the work it did not think worth a Threnvi's hands. They had all grown up under the same story. The strong rule because the strong are strong, and that is the order, and the order is the world. And they watched a waste hauler, one of their own, become the strongest thing the order had ever made, and put down its crown and choose, in front of all of them, where it could not be edited, to be gentle from the top of the strength. And the thing the line master had most feared, the thing Warden Korun had spent 60 cycles keeping his hold clear of, happened not in the hall but everywhere the hall was seen, all at once, quietly, in the space behind 100 million watching eyes. The low caste stopped believing that strength was the crown's by right. Because they had just watched the real top of the strength refuse the crown. And if the strongest thing in the order did not believe that strength meant the right to rule, then the whole story the order stood on was just a thing the strong had said to explain why they were on top. And now the strongest of all had said, in front of everyone, that it was not true. Vashka Drawn understood it before anyone. She had stood beside the cohort, in the place the line master had assumed she would lead from, and she had not moved to lead it, and every world had seen the master of conferrals stand still while the cohort fell, and that stillness was its own record. When the line master's blade lay on the floor and the human stood whole in the light, Drawn stepped out from beside the ruined cohort, into the center of the hall, into the witnessing, and she did the thing that ended her career and founded whatever came after it. She knelt to the fallen warriors, not to the human, to her own cohort, and she checked them, one by one, the master of conferrals confirming with her own conferred senses what the whole galaxy needed confirmed, that they lived, that every one of them lived. And then she stood in the center of the light, and she spoke to the witnessing in the flat voice of the iron caste, and she said the thing that no member of her caste had ever said, and that could not be unsaid once every world had heard it. "I have conferred the right 400 times, Vashka Drawn said. I have buried 206 frames the right broke. I have spent my life believing that the breaking was the price of the crown, and that the crown was ours because only we could pay it. I stood beside this cohort today to see the order enforced." She looked at the 12 living warriors on the bright floor, and at the human standing whole above them, and at the line master's blade lying between them where the human had set it down. The order was not enforced today. The order was answered. A frame the right could not break, that paid no price, that holds a strength past every ceiling we ever drew, and it put down the crown's strongest cohort without ending one of them, and stopped a line master's blade in its bare hand, and set the blade down and asked for nothing. She was quiet a moment, an old iron caste warrior in the shadowless light, and when she spoke again the flat voice had something in it the witnessing had never carried from her caste. "I have spent my life certain that strength was the right to rule. I watched the strongest thing I have ever seen decline the right in front of all of you at no gain to itself. I cannot confer that certainty on another candidate now. I will not. Let the record show that the master of conferrals looked at the top of the strength and saw what it chose, and could not go on pretending the crown was earned. The crown did not answer the hall for 2 watches, and the silence of those 2 watches was the loudest thing the Concordat had ever not said. Aminet spent them in the physician's vault with the record, because he understood that the record was now the whole of the fight. The hall was over. The witnessing had carried it true to every world, and no writ could reach into 100 million eyes and unsee it. But a thing seen could still be renamed, and renaming was the crown's oldest craft, and Aminet knew, with the cold clarity of a Selvik who had spent 30 cycles watching the Order file inconvenient truths into gray categories until they vanished, that the Crown's first move would not be against the human. It would be against the meaning of the human. They would let the world keep the image and take away the name of it. They would call her a weapon, a rogue augment, a malfunction of the Rite, a danger to every world, a thing that had put down 12 warriors and would, left alone, put down 12,000. They would make the mercy into a mask over a monster, because a monster restored the order. A monster was a thing the strong protected you from, and the only defense against the renaming was a record honest enough and public enough that the new name would not stick to it. So Aminet did the second thing his caste had won the right to do in a plague 10,000 cycles gone. A physician's finding, sealed to the physician's caste, could not be reached by any warrior's writ, and it could also, by the same ancient protection, be published to every physician's hall in the Concordat at the finding physician's sole discretion, over any objection of the Crown, because the plague had taught the Order that a physician who could be silenced was a physician who let worlds die, and the Order had needed its physicians unsilenceable ever since. Aminet had never had cause to invoke it. He invoked it now. He took the honest record, the fault, the frame that paid nothing, the counter-right that fed her, the 11 watches of a strength past every ceiling held on the shortest leash, and at the top, what follows the subject chose. Remember that it could have chosen otherwise and did not, and he published it, physician, to every Selvik hall on every world under the Crown, beyond recall, beyond renaming, before the Crown had finished deciding what to call her. By the time the Crown answered the hall, the Crown's new name for the human was already contradicted. In the calm, unsilenceable voice of the physician's caste, on every world the new name would have to travel through. The Crown's answer when it came was a fleet, not a cohort. A cohort had been the line master's answer, and the line master's answer lay whole and stunned on the floor of the great hall for every world to see. The Crown had learned the lesson of the hall, or thought it had. The fault could not be corrected by strength that entered the same room as it. So the Crown reached for the one kind of strength that never had to enter the room. It dispatched an iron ministry fleet to Meridian Hold, with authority over the hold and everything in it, and orders that Warden Korun received in his high office under the dome and read twice, and set down with a hand that did not shake, because a Selvik of 60 cycles had learned long ago that the hand shaking changed nothing. The orders were clean. The fleet would take custody of the subject. The hold would surrender it, and the physician's record, and the witnessing's record, and every copy of both. The subject would be removed to a ministry facility beyond the reach of any witnessing, where the study the hold had failed to complete would be completed in the dark, and whatever the study found would be the only account of the human that the Order permitted to exist. And Meridian Hold, which had become the story, would receive a new warden and a purge of its records, and the quiet that the Order gave to holds that had embarrassed it. Korun summoned Aminet and Drawn to the high office one last time, and told them the shape of the orders, and the three of them, a Selvik warden, a Selvik registrar, and an iron caste master of conferrals who had knelt to her own fallen cohort in front of the galaxy, sat in the daylight, and understood that the Crown had found the one move the hall could not answer. Ren could put down anything that came into the room, but a fleet did not come into the room. A fleet took the whole building, and everyone in it, and no restraint at the top of the strength could untie a knot that never let itself be gripped. She will not fight a fleet, Aminet said. Even if she could reach it, and I do not know that she cannot, I have stopped assuming I know the top of her frame, she would not. She told me the shape of it the watch she woke. If she fights, she wins, and winning makes her the monster the Order needs. A cohort in a hall she could answer with mercy, because the mercy was visible. A fleet from orbit gives her nothing to be merciful to. It gives her only the choice between being taken and being a catastrophe, and she will let herself be taken before she will be a catastrophe. That is who she is. The Crown has found the move that turns her own restraint into the leash. Drawn was quiet for a long moment. She had spent her life in the certainties of the iron caste, and she had watched them come apart in a hall, and she found, in the wreckage of them, that she understood the human better than she understood the fleet, because she had stood an arm's length from the human and read its frame, and she had never once in 400 conferrals read a frame that chose so consistently, at such cost, to spill the least. Then we do not let it come to that choice, Drawn said. It is a ministry fleet, Karun said. I am a Selvik warden. I have no authority over a fleet. No, Drawn said, but I am the master of conferrals, and I have led the crown's cohorts, and I know the one thing the fleet's orders assume and cannot verify from orbit. She looked at the warden. The orders say, take custody of the subject and the record and the witnessing, and remove them beyond the reach of any witnessing. The orders assume the subject can be found in the building when the fleet arrives. They assume the record can be seized. They assume the removal can be done in the dark. She stood, an old iron caste warrior in the failing daylight. Every one of those assumptions is a thing we control from inside the building, in the watches before the fleet arrives. The record is already published, physician to physician, beyond seizure. The registrar saw to that. The witnessing's record is already on every world, and the subject, she paused. The subject does not have to be in the building. The crown's whole move depends on the removal happening where no one can see it. So we make certain that wherever the subject goes, she goes in front of witnesses and stays in front of them, and never once enters the dark the ministry needs. We cannot beat the fleet. We can make the fleet unable to do the one thing it was sent to do, take her somewhere unwatched. Because the moment the order has to correct her in the light, it loses, and it has already lost every correction it has tried in the light. Ren heard the plan from Aminet in the cell. She was still in the cell. She had walked back into it herself after the hall, uncuffed, because the cell was where the building expected her, and a building that got what it expected stayed calmer, and a calm building spilled less. And she listened to all of it, the fleet, the orders, the dark facility, the crown's one unanswerable move. And when Aminet had finished, she was quiet for a while in the bar of daylight. You've all decided to burn your own lives down for this, she said at last. It was not a question. The warden's going to lose his hold. The instructor's already lost her caste out loud where every world heard it, and you published a record you can't take back, physician to physician, which means you can't take yourself back either. You've all crossed the line where the crown stops seeing you as its own. She looked up at the dark rectangle of the glass. Why, I'm not caste. I'm not even Threnvi. 6 weeks ago I hauled waste and none of you would have looked at me twice. Why is an old registrar and an old warden and the master of conferrals throwing away everything they spent their whole lives building for a piece of threshold stock the order threw away on purpose? Aminet was quiet a moment. Then he said the true thing, because he had promised her true things and had found, over 11 watches and a hall, that they came easier now. Because you showed us what we were, he said. Not with a speech. You never made a speech until the line master forced one out of you, and even then it was 6 sentences and you set his blade down in the middle of it. You showed us. I spent 30 cycles logging the frames the Rite broke and calling the breaking necessary, and you took the Rite and paid nothing, and proved the breaking was never necessary. Only convenient for a caste that needed the price to be real so the crown would feel earned. Drawn conferred that Rite 400 times on the same lie. Karun kept a whole hold quiet in service of it. And then a stylus skipped, and you woke up on a warrior's bench, and instead of becoming the monster that would have proven us right, you became the one thing our whole order had no answer for, someone stronger than all of us who refused to use it the way we use it. You did not throw our lives down, Ren. You showed us they were already spent on the wrong thing, and gave us the one chance we will ever get to spend what's left on the right one. He paused. You asked me once whether the strength made it better or worse for you. I will tell you what it made for us. It made us choose. For 30 cycles the order chose for me, and I called the choosing piece. You took that away. I find I would not give it back. Ren was silent for a long moment in the daylight. All right, she said. Then here's how we don't waste it. She stood slowly, the correct speed for the room, and the vast quiet reserve moved behind her thin, pale surface like a tide that had never once been all the way loosed. Your plan is good. Keep me in the light, never let them take me into the dark. Make the crown correct me where every world can see, because every correction in the light is a correction they lose. It's good. But it's still a plan for staying still and making them come to me, and I've spent 6 years in a pen learning that staying still is how the strong decide the shape of your life. So we're going to do it moving. She looked at the dark glass. The fleet's coming here because here is where the story is. So before it arrives, I'm going to leave in the light in front of the witnessing on a labor transit, the way I came up, and I'm going to go down to the pens. The surface pens, where the threshold stock is, where I'm from. And I'm going to stand in the middle of the ones the order threw away in the open, where the fleet would have to come down out of orbit and correct me in front of 100,000 of its own discarded workers to take me at all. She almost smiled and did not, because the pens had taught her that too. The crown's whole move depends on taking me somewhere no one can see. So I'm going to go stand in the one place they can never make dark, the middle of the people they've spent 10,000 cycles pretending not to see. She left Meridian hold the way she had come to it, on a labor transit in the light, in front of the witnessing. Because the witnessing caste, once summoned to record a correction, recorded until the correction was concluded, and the correction was not concluded, and so its apparatus followed the human out of the great hall and down the docking spine and onto the transit, carrying every step of it to every world under the crown. Warden Korun signed the transit's manifest himself, one last act of a warden who had already lost his hold, and logged the human's designation in the field that had been blank since the day a stylus skipped, and where the manifest asked for provenance he entered the true one. Human, of the surface pens, returned to them by her own choice in the light before witnesses. It was the last clean record Meridian hold ever kept, and Korun kept it honest. The transit went down through the bright atmosphere to the surface, and the surface was where the pens were, and the pens were where the threshold stock hauled the waste of a caste that did not think the hauling worth a Threnvi's hands. And by the time the transit set down, the pens already knew she was coming, because the pens had watched the hall like every other discarded corner of the order, and word in a pen moved faster than any fleet. Fleet Master Osk Ven had put down 4 uprisings in the Crown's service, and he had expected the 5th to be the easiest of his career, because the 5th was a single unarmed subject on an undefended surface, and he had a ministry fleet, and the subject had already announced exactly where she would be. He watched the surface through the fleet's eye as his ships came into orbit over the pens, and the ease of it curdled in him watch by watch, because the surface was not doing what a surface did when a fleet arrived over it. A surface, correctly ordered, emptied. The workers went to ground, the pens sealed, the open spaces cleared, and the fleet's correction fell on whatever remained in the open, cleanly, with no one to see it but the corrected. That was how a fleet took a subject in the dark even in broad daylight. It made the ground beneath it empty, and emptiness was its own kind of dark. The ground beneath Osk Ven was not emptying, it was filling. He watched through the fleet's eye as the threshold stock came up out of the pens, not to fight. His instruments read no weapons, no massing, no charge. They came up empty-handed and stood in the open in the bright daylight, in numbers his instruments strained to count, and they filled the open ground around the small pale figure of the human until there was no empty place left for a correction to fall. They did not raise their hands. They did not raise their voices. They came up out of the pens the order had put them in, 100,000 and then more, the discarded labor of 100 worlds worth of the same story, and they stood around the strongest thing the order had ever made in the light and looked up at the fleet and waited to be corrected. And the witnessing carried it to every world. Fleet Master Osk Ven understood, watching his easy correction fill with witnesses by the 100,000, that he had been handed a set of orders that assumed a thing his instruments were now telling him was false, The orders assumed the removal could be done in the dark. There was no dark. The human had gone to the one place on the surface the fleet could never make empty, and stood in the middle of it. And the order's own discarded masses had come up out of the ground to make certain the light stayed on. And now SciFiNarration had a choice that was not a choice. Correct the subject in front of 100,000 of the order's own workers, on the witnessing, on every world, bring the fleet's fire down into that filled bright ground and take the subject, and however many thousands of the crown's own labor stood too close, or do nothing, and let the fleet sit in orbit over a surface it could not touch, in front of every world, unable to enforce an order it had been sent specifically to enforce. The first was a massacre the witnessing would carry to every world the order ruled, and every discarded corner of the order would see the crown murder its own workers by the thousand to erase a single one who had put down its cohort, and let the cohort live. And there was not a story in the crown's whole craft that could rename that into anything but what it was. The second was the crown's fleet held helpless over an unarmed crowd by nothing but the crown's unwillingness to be seen doing what it had come to do, which was its own record, carried to every world, of a fleet that could not act because acting would end it. SciFiNarration had put down 4 uprisings. Every one of them had given him something to put down, a massing, a charge, a weapon, an enemy that the correction could fall on cleanly and be called defense. This was the first that had given him nothing, 100,000 empty hands and a subject who had not so much as looked up at his fleet with anything he could call a threat. He sat in the fleet's eye above the filled bright ground and understood that the human had done to his fleet exactly what she had done to the cohort in the hall. She had untied it. She had presented it with the full committed weight of its own strength, and given it nothing to strike that striking would not destroy the striker. The cohort had come at her with the Rite, and she had turned the Rite's own force into the thing that set it down whole. She had turned the fleet's own overwhelming strength into the thing that made the fleet unusable, because a strength that could only be used by murdering the crown's own masses in front of every world was not a strength at all. It was a leash the crown had put on its own throat and handed her the end of. On the filled bright ground, Ren stood among the discarded and did not lead them. That was the thing Aminet had understood about her, and the thing the crown could not, because the crown had no category for it. She did not lead them. She had come down to the pens and stood in the middle of the ones the order had thrown away, and they had come up out of the ground around her, 100,000 strong, the largest thing the low castes had ever been in one place, and every instinct the order had told it that such a mass had one shape, a rising, a leader, a strength gathering to take the crown by force. And Ren stood in the middle of it and refused to be the leader, and refused to give the mass the shape the crown was braced for, because she understood, better than anyone in orbit or on the surface, that the moment she led them she became the thing that justified the fleet. A leader could be corrected. An uprising could be put down. A strength gathering to take the crown was a thing the crown knew how to fight and had fought for 10,000 cycles and would fight gladly, because fighting it was the order's whole reason to exist. So she did not lead. She stood in the middle of the crowd, one small pale figure among 100,000, no more raised than any of them, and she let the crowd be exactly what it was, not an army, not a rising, just the discarded standing in the open, refusing to empty the ground so the fleet could pretend the dark was there. She had spent her whole life learning that the strength no one knows you have is the only strength that lasts, and she applied it now at a scale no pen had ever taught her. She held the strength of 100,000 banked and quiet and pointed at nothing, the way she had held her own, because a strength pointed at nothing could not be fought, and a strength that could not be fought could only be waited out, and the crown did not have the patience of the pens. She looked up once at the fleet in the bright sky. "They're waiting for us to become an army," she said, to the ones close enough to hear, and the witnessing carried it up to the fleet and out to every world. "That's the only thing they know how to answer, So we're not going to be one. We're just going to stand here in the light where they threw us and be seen. That's all. That's the whole thing. We don't take the crown. We don't have to. We just have to make it impossible for them to keep pretending we're not here, and they've already done the hard part for us because they brought a fleet. And a fleet over 100,000 empty hands isn't a correction. It's a confession. She did not raise her voice. She never had. Let them sit up there and decide what they are. We already know what we are. We're the part of their order they built on and threw away, and we're not going anywhere. And there's nothing they can do about it that doesn't cost them the one thing holding their whole crown up: the story that this was ever fair. The fleet held over the pens for 6 watches, and in the 6th watch Fleetmaster Ven made the decision that the crown would spend a generation pretending had been an order and not a refusal. He did not fire. He had put down 4 uprisings, and he knew the exact weight of the order in his hands, and he weighed it against the filled bright ground and the witnessing and the 100,000 empty hands, and he found that the order was asking him to do the one thing that would end the crown faster than any uprising ever could. An uprising put down was the order enforced. 100,000 of the crown's own workers burned out of the open to erase a single subject who had hurt no one was the order confessing, on every world, that it had never been anything but the strong taking from the weak and calling it right. Ven had served the story his whole life. He discovered in the 6th watch that he had served it because he had believed it, and that he could not fire on the belief once he had seen the shape of what firing would prove. He sent the crown a message that was, in the flat language of a fleet master to his ministry, a refusal dressed as a report. The subject cannot be corrected without correcting 100,000 of the Concordat's own labor in full view of the witnessing and every world. The subject has committed no act of force. The subject leads nothing. There is no command structure to remove. There is no massing to disperse. To act is to confess the order. To hold is to be seen unable to act. I request revised orders. And then, because he was a fleet master and not a coward, he added the line that ended his own service and began whatever the Concordat became after. I will not be the fleet that burned the crown's own workers to preserve a story the strongest being in the order has already declined to believe. The crown did not send revised orders. The crown, faced with a fleet master who would not fire, and a master of conferrals who had knelt to her own cohort, and a physician's record on every world and 100,000 empty hands standing in the light, did the thing that orders do when the story that holds them up stops being believed all at once, in 1,000 rooms, by the people who had been believing it out of habit. It went quiet. It did not fall. Orders do not fall in an hour. But it went quiet, and the quiet was the sound of a crown that had reached for its last unanswerable move, and found the human standing in the middle of it, having answered it before it was made, with nothing but the refusal to be either a monster or a leader. The fleet withdrew from orbit over the pens on the 7th watch. The witnessing carried the withdrawal to every world. The crown's fleet, sent to take a single subject, turning and going, having taken nothing, in front of every discarded corner of the order it ruled. It was not a victory anyone could point to. No one had won a hall or a world. But the low castes on 100 worlds watched the fleet withdraw, and understood the shape of it exactly as Ren had understood the shape of the counter-Rite, and the shape of the witnessing and the shape of the fleet. The crown had brought its ultimate strength to bear on the discarded, and the discarded had simply stood in the light and refused to give it a target, and the ultimate strength had turned out to be a leash the crown wore on its own throat, and a strength that could only be used by proving your own order a lie, was not a strength the order could use again. Sevet Carrick was not corrected in the end by the human or the fleet or the crown. He was corrected by the record. The line master had built his whole life on the certainty that strength was the iron castes by Rite, and the crown was earned by the frame that could bear the Rite, and he had watched a waste hauler wear the Rite better than his son and put down his cohort whole, and stop his own ancestral blade in her bare hand. And he had understood in the hall what all of it meant, and he had reached for his blade rather than live in a world where it was true. The crown, going quiet, could not use him, a line master who had demanded a public correction that had corrected his own order in front of every world, was not an asset the ministries could keep near them. They set him aside, quietly, the way the order set aside everything that had become the story, and the setting aside was its own answer to the certainty he had staked his life on. The crown he had served did not, in the end, believe that strength was earned either. It believed in staying out of the story, and he had put it in the largest story it had ever told. And so the crown discarded the line master exactly as it had always discarded the labor, and Sevet Karak learned, too late to do anything with the learning, that he had never been the crown. He had only been another frame the order used and set aside when the using was done. His son, Karak, was recovered from the surface pens where a skipping stylus had sent him, and was not conferred the right, because Vashka Drawn had said in front of every world that she would confer it on no one again, and no other master of conferrals would touch the cohort's ruin. Karak returned to his line unconferred, the first Karak in 11 generations to bear no right, and the line that had carried the marrowing for 11 generations ended its long conferred descent, not with a breaking, but with a young Vantor who had spent 6 weeks hauling waste in the pens and come back knowing, in his frame, what the discarded knew, which was more than any conferral had ever taught his line. Aminet found Ren on the filled bright ground on the 8th watch, after the fleet had gone, when the 100,000 had begun slowly to disperse back to the pens, not because they had been ordered to, but because the standing was done and the point was made, and the pens still needed hauling, and the discarded had always understood that the work did not stop for a story. He came down on a labor transit, an old Selvik registrar with no hold behind him anymore, because Meridian Hold had a new warden now and Korun was gone, and the physician's vault was published to every world, and there was nothing left for Aminet in the bright institution but the empty stations where he had measured her. He found her sitting on a low wall at the edge of the pens, in a bar of daylight, the way she had sat on the edge of the warrior's bench, small and pale and marked with the tracery of the Rite, watching the discarded go back to their work. "You did not take the crown," Aminet said, sitting beside her, an old physician who had run out of measurements. "You could have." In the hall on the ground, with the fleet in the sky and 100,000 behind you, there was a watch, Ren. I think there was a watch when the whole order would have followed you, if you had only reached for it. And you stood in the middle of it and reached for nothing. "I know," Ren said. She watched a line of haulers move a load the way she had once moved it. That was the point. It was always the point. She was quiet a moment. "The order's whole story is that the strongest thing in the room should rule it. If I take the crown, I don't break the story, registrar. I prove it. I just become the new strongest thing at the top, and the pens fill back up under me. And in 10,000 cycles some other stylus skips and some other discarded thing wears the right better than my heirs, and the whole thing runs again. The only way to break a story that says the strongest should rule is to be the strongest and not rule. To stand in the middle of everything you could take, and take none of it in the light where they can't unsee it. That's not mercy for the 12 in the hall or the line master or the fleet. That's mercy for the 10,000 cycles that would have come after if I'd done the ordinary thing with an extraordinary strength." She almost smiled, and this time a little she let it. "The pens taught me that, not the Rite. The Rite just gave me enough strength that, when I did the thing the pens taught me, everyone had to watch." Aminet looked at her for a long moment in the bar of daylight. "What will you do now?" he said. "The crown has gone quiet, but quiet is not gone. It will find a shape again, it always does. And whatever shape it finds, you will still be the strongest thing under it at no cost, growing. My instruments never found your ceiling, Ren. You are stronger now than you were in the hall. In a cycle you will be stronger than you are now. That does not stop. The one thing I could measure about you is the one thing that has no end. What does a person do who cannot be corrected and will not rule and only grows? Ren watched the discarded go back to their work in the light. The same thing I've done every watch since I woke up on that bench, she said. Hold it, hide most of it, and use as little as the room requires and not one increment more. She stood slowly the correct speed for the ground. The crown thinks the danger is that I'll take everything. It was never that. The danger to them was always that I'd take nothing and let everyone watch me take nothing and make the taking nothing the thing the pens remember instead of the crown. I've done that now. It's on every world. It doesn't unhappen. She looked down at the old registrar who had made her true before they could make her a lie. So now I go back to the pens registrar, where I'm from. And I haul and I stand in the light and I stay exactly as visible as I was on that ground. So the crown can never once forget that the strongest thing in its order is down here, in the part it threw away, choosing every single watch not to come up and take what it's so afraid I'll take. That's the whole job now. Being the thing they can't correct and won't rule in plain sight forever. It's not a crown. It's better. A crown you can lose. The record did the slow work after the fleet was gone, in the 1,000 rooms where orders actually fall. Aminet's finding, published physician to physician and beyond any writ's recall, sat now in every Selvig hall on every world under the crown, and it said, in the calm, unsilenceable voice of the physician's caste, the one thing the order could not survive being said in that voice. The price was never necessary. The marrowing broke the frames it was spent on because breaking was convenient, not because strength required it, and here was the proof, a frame that had taken the Rite and paid nothing, and the only thing that had made the price real for 10,000 cycles was a caste that needed the crown to feel earned. Physicians read it. Physicians are a careful caste, slow to move, and they did not rise, and they did not proclaim, and they did nothing at all that the crown could point to. They simply began, quietly in their careful way, to stop conferring the Rite. A candidate would come to a marrowing hall, cleared and blooded and ready, and the physician of record would find a reason to defer and defer again, and the deferral would hold, because a physician who had read Aminet's finding could no longer put a frame on a bench and call the breaking honor with a straight face. The Iron Caste's conferrals did not stop by decree. They stopped one deferred candidate at a time in 1,000 halls by 1,000 careful physicians who had read a record they could not unread. And a caste that stops being renewed is a caste with a horizon. And the Iron Caste, for the first time in 10,000 cycles, could see its own. Vashka Drawn conferred the Rite no more, as she had said in front of every world she would not, and she did not stay in the hold, and she did not go home to the Iron Caste that had no place for a master of conferrals who had knelt to her own fallen cohort. She went instead to the halls of the young, the training halls, where the Iron Caste raised its candidates to want the breaking, to believe from the first breath that visible strength was the crown of the world, and the price of the Rite and honor. She went to those halls, an old warrior who had buried 206 frames, and she told the young the truth she had spent her life not telling, that she had seen the top of the strength, and it had belonged to a thing the order threw away, and it had declined the crown, and that everything they had been raised to believe about what strength was for had been answered, once in a bright hall, by a small pale thing that set a line master's blade down and asked for nothing. She could not unconfer the Rite from the 400 she had made, but she could stand in front of the ones not yet made, and be the record they heard it from, and let the wanting die in them before the Rite could be spent on it. It was not a large thing to do. It was the largest thing left, and she did it, and did not regret the caste it cost her. Korun, who had spent 60 cycles keeping his hold out of the story, lived out the rest of his cycles as the warden who had put it in the largest story the order ever told, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not mind. A new warden ran Meridian Hold now, a careful ministry appointee who had orders to let the story die, and the story did not die, because the record was on every world and the witnessing was on every world, and 100,000 had stood in the light, and there is no warden careful enough to untell a thing every world has seen. Korun went to the surface near the pens, the way old Selvik sometimes did when their holds were done with them, and he kept a private ledger, unsealed, unofficial, of the thing he had watched, because a Selvik who stops keeping the record is no longer Selvik, and Korun was Selvik to the last of his cycles, and the record he kept was honest. The crown made one more attempt on the human, and it was the smallest and the last, and it proved the pattern holds all the way down. It could not send a fleet again. The fleet had shown it what a fleet cost now. It could not send a cohort. The cohort lay whole in every world's memory. So it did the thing orders do when the large moves are closed to them. It sent one. A single iron caste zealot, conferred and old and true, who had watched the hall and the ground and the fleet and could not live in a world where the crown had gone quiet, and who came down to the pens alone, on no one's writ, to do in the dark the correction the whole order had failed to do in the light, to kill the human privately, in a pen, where the witnessing was not, and give the crown back its story by giving it a martyr's silence instead of a martyr's speech. He found her at the edge of the pens in a bar of daylight, hauling, the way she had said she would, one small pale figure among the discarded, and he came at her with the full conferred strength of the Rite and the certainty of a caste that had run out of every move but this one. The pens saw it. That was the thing the zealot had not accounted for, because the order had never once had to account for the discarded seeing anything. The pens saw him come, and the pens did not scatter, because the pens had watched the hall too, and had learned from the small pale thing in it, the one lesson the order had spent 10,000 cycles making sure they never learned, that you do not have to run from the strong if you are willing to be seen not running. So the haulers stopped and stood and watched, 100 of them and then 1,000, empty-handed in the light, and they made the dark the zealot needed impossible the way the crowd had made it impossible for the fleet, by the simple refusal to look away. And Ren, who had felt him coming the way she felt everything coming now, set down her load and turned, and took the zealot's strength out of the air the way she had taken the cohorts and the line masters, the enormous quiet load blooming in her small hand. The conferred frame stopped whole and stunned and disarmed in the bar of daylight, and she did not break him, and she did not end him, and she set him down among the discarded he had come to prove were beneath her, and let him live. In front of all of them in the light. You came to do it where no one could see, Ren said to him, quietly, standing over the conferred frame she had set down whole. There's no such place anymore. That's the thing your crown still hasn't understood. You made me strong enough that everything I do is watched, and then you spent 10,000 cycles teaching the pens to keep their eyes down, and I only had to teach them one thing to undo all of it. I only had to show them once that the strongest thing in the order was down here with them, keeping its eyes up. She stepped back from him and picked her load back up, because the work did not stop for a story. Go home. Tell whoever sent you that there's no dark left to take me into. Tell them the strongest thing in their order hauls waste in the light on purpose, and lets your zealots live on purpose, and that every watch it does it, the crown they're trying to save gets a little harder to believe in. I'm not going to hurt them. I've never been going to hurt them. That's what they can't stand. A thing they can't correct that won't hurt them is a thing they can only wait out, and I'll outlast them, because I don't get tired and I don't get weaker, and I don't want the one thing they built their whole world to hold on to. She turned back to the load. Tell them the waste hauler said the crown is safe from her, and watch how much that frightens them. It'll tell you everything about what the crown was really for. The zealot went home, whole and disarmed, and told whoever had sent him exactly what the human had said, and the telling did the crown no good at all, because the crown had already learned the lesson the zealot carried and had already been unable to do anything with it. But the pens on other worlds heard it too, the way the pens heard everything now, and the hearing did the thing the crown feared most, which was spread. It spread first to a labor world 3 transits from the pens, where the discarded had watched the ground fill, and the fleet withdraw on the witnessing like everyone else, and where an iron caste overseer, cycles later, moved on a hauler in the old way, in the open, certain of the old outcome. The hauler did not have the right and was not strong, and could not have put the overseer down if the whole pen had helped, but the pen did not scatter. The pen stood, empty-handed in the light, and kept its eyes up, 1,000 of them and then more, and made the dark the overseer needed impossible by the single refusal the human had taught the whole order its discarded were capable of. And the overseer, faced with 1,000 pairs of eyes that would not go down, did the thing the crown's whole strength had discovered it must do over the filled bright ground. Nothing. Because there was nothing to strike that striking would not confess, and the overseer had watched a fleet learn that over the same kind of ground, and had no wish to be the smaller version of the same lesson. No one on that world was strong. That was the thing the crown could not answer, worse even than the human. The human at least was a strength, and a strength could in theory be planned against, cornered, waited out for some ceiling that never came. But the thing the human had shown the pens was not a strength. It was a posture. Eyes up in the light together, and it required no right and no marrowing and no frame past any ceiling. It required only that the discarded had seen it done once at the top of the strength, by one of their own, and understood that it worked. You cannot send a fleet against a posture. You cannot confer a right to defeat a way of standing. The crown had spent 10,000 cycles making certain no strength ever reached the pens, and had, by a skipping stylus, delivered the pens the one thing more dangerous than strength, the knowledge that they had never needed it. The witnessing caste felt the change in its own work before the ministries would admit it. Its charge had always been to record the great corrections of the order, so that every world would see the order enforced. Now its apparatus recorded, watch after watch, corrections that did not conclude overseers who stood down, cohorts uncalled, 100 small halls and grounds where the discarded stood in the light and the strong found nothing to strike, and a witnessing that records the strong unable to act is no longer recording the order's enforcement. It is recording the order's horizon. The witnessing did not rebel. It was not that kind of caste. It went on recording true, because it recorded true or not at all, and the true thing it now recorded, on every world, was a crown that had run out of corrections that did not cost it more than they bought. The cycles that followed did not have a single day the historians could point to, because the order did not fall on a day. It fell the way Wren had told the crowd it would fall, in the space behind 100 million watching eyes, all at once and very slowly, as the story that held it up stopped being believed by the people who had only ever believed it out of habit and fear. The physician's caste made Amonet's finding canonical, in the end not by proclamation, which was not their way, but by the slow accretion of 1,000 halls citing it until it was simply the settled truth. The marrowing's price was never necessary. The breaking was convenience dressed as honor, and the proof was a human frame that took the right and paid nothing, on the record, unrecallable on every world. And once that was the settled truth, the right could not be conferred as an honor anymore, because you cannot ask a frame to pay a price your own physicians have proven was never owed, and the iron caste's whole claim to the crown had rested on the paying. A caste that can no longer be renewed by a right no one will confer is a caste with a horizon, and the iron caste lived out its horizon over the cycles that followed the way the line master had lived out his, set aside, quietly, by an order that had never really believed in earned strength at all, only in staying out of the story, and could not stay out of this one. The pens did not empty, and the crown did not crumble into some clean new thing, because worlds do not work that way and Wren had never once promised they would. But the discarded on 100 worlds stood a little differently after the ground filled and the fleet withdrew, because they had learned the one thing the order had spent 10,000 cycles making sure they never learned, that the strong needed them to look down, and that looking up in the light together was a strength no fleet could correct. The crown could still order the hauling. It could no longer make the haulers believe the hauling was the natural order of a just world, and a crown that rules by force alone, without the story that the force is right, is a crown already on its way down, however long the way takes. And through all of it, in the part of the order it had thrown away, the strongest thing the Concordat had ever made hauled waste in the light on purpose, and grew stronger every cycle, and took nothing. Aminet kept the record to the end of his cycles, and the last entry he made in it was not a measurement, because there was nothing left to measure that he had not measured 100 times. Her frame still climbed, still paid nothing, still had no ceiling he could find, and he had stopped, long ago, expecting it to. The last entry was a single observation, made on a bright watch near the pens, of the human sitting on a low wall in a bar of daylight, watching the discarded go back to their work, exactly as she had sat the day the fleet withdrew, unchanged in every way that mattered and stronger in the one way that did not. She was, by then, stronger than anything the settled galaxy had a number for. Aminet's instruments, when she let him run them, which she still did, because he had made her true and she had not forgotten it, returned readings the physician's reference had no gridlines for, columns of figures that meant only that the slope had gone on climbing and would go on climbing after the old registrar was gone. She could have done anything. That was the plain fact of her, the fact the crown had spent its last strength trying to erase and had only carved deeper into every world. She could have done anything, taken anything, ruled anything, ended anything. And she sat on a low wall at the edge of the pens and watched the haulers work and did none of it, watch after watch after watch, and the not doing was the whole of her power, because a strength that will not be used cannot be answered, and a strength that only grows can be waited out by no one. You could have been their god, Aminet said to her on that last bright watch, an old Selvic physician at the end of his measuring, or their king, or their monster. Every one of those was inside your reach, and every one of those the order would have known what to do with. It has answers for gods and kings and monsters. It has spent 10,000 cycles building them. He looked at the small, pale figure in the daylight, marked with the tracery of a Rite meant for someone else. It had no answer for a hauler. That is what you understood that none of us did. The one thing the order could not survive was the strongest thing in it choosing to stay the smallest. Ren was quiet for a while, watching the work. "Where I'm from, there's no such thing as a god who hauls," she said at last. "There's no king in a pen. The strong left always, they went up. They took the crown, that's what strong was for, that's the whole story, and the story was true because it kept coming true. Over and over, every time somebody strong went up and left the rest of us down here to teach our kids to keep their eyes down." She flexed one small hand in the daylight, the vast unmeasured reserve moving behind it like a tide that would never once be loosed. "So I stayed. That's all. That's the whole thing I did that they couldn't answer. I got handed everything strong was ever supposed to be for, and I stayed down here in the light where they threw me, and I made the staying the thing my kids will teach theirs instead. Not the crown. The staying." She almost smiled and let it a little. "They built a Rite to make the perfect thing to go up, and they gave it by mistake to the one kind of creature that would rather stay. That's not their tragedy, Registrar, that's just the bill. They spent 10,000 cycles teaching the galaxy that strength means leaving. And then they made something too strong to argue with, and it looked at everything they'd built, and it stayed." Aminet died in his sleep 2 cycles later, an old Selvic physician on the surface near the pens, and the record he had kept passed to the physician's caste and became, over the long cycles, simply the truth. The way the finding had the account of the day a stylus skipped, and the order handed its most guarded strength to the one it had thrown away, and got back, not the monster it had braced for, but the one answer its whole world had no room for. The human stayed. She was still there when the last of the crown's careful wardens gave up trying to make the story die, and still there when the conferrals had stopped in every hall, and still there, unchanged in the ways that mattered, when the discarded on 100 worlds had grown their children on a different lesson, than the one the order had grown them on. She hauled in the light. She let the zealots the crown still sometimes sent go home whole. She took nothing, and grew stronger, and stayed the smallest thing in every room she could have owned. And the order that had made her by mistake spent the rest of its long decline learning the single fact it had been too certain to learn any other way, that it had never really feared the strength. It had built a whole caste to hold the strength and had slept soundly with the strength in the right hands. What it had never once built a defense against, because it had never once imagined it could be needed, was the strength that had read the whole cold machinery of the crown and understood exactly what it was for, and quietly in the light, in front of everyone the crown had thrown away, refused to turn it. They had drawn a ceiling and called it the outer wall of what a body could hold. She had gone past it and kept climbing and never once used the climb. And that, in the end, was the finding the physician's caste never had to write down, because every world had already seen it. The most dangerous thing the galaxy ever made was not the one that could break the crown. It was the one that could, and looked the crown in the eye and set it down, and went back to work.